The point of the story, why Luke includes it, is because this man, they meet on the road, these two disciples, was Jesus just after his resurrection. And we note from the earlier stories of the women and the disciples who ran to the tomb to see what happened to Jesus, a number of them didn't realise who it was when they first met him. It wasn't until he did something significant like talk to them, call their name, or in this case, when he sat down there and broke bread and drank wine with them, repeating the words that we know today as the Lord's Supper. So it was just an interesting clip of how somebody interprets that story. But let's go back to the beginning. The road to Emmaus. It's quite important for us to understand that Luke included this story because we as Christians need to believe that Jesus came back from the dead. And it's what separates the Christian faith from all other faiths that have ever been or will ever come into existence, I suppose. The fundamental difference with Christianity is we believe that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, actually came to this earth to pronounce God's mission to the people he loved in order that they might love him. And to do that and restore the relationship, he had to die as a sacrifice for us all. But that death wasn't final. It was the beginning of new life for him and for all those who come after him believing. No other religion claims that their leader and founder was raised from the dead. There are 10 resurrection appearances we have in the New Testament. Jesus appears to the odd person or to a number of people in different places, in different circumstances. And we learned very much of the way he appeared to Mary Magdalene last week. But he not only appeared near the tomb and in the upper room, but on the road to Emmaus, on the lake at Galilee, on a Galilean mountain, and back on the Mount of Olives. Sometimes he met the people who were really mourning his death. Other people gradually understood that he'd come back to life from the reports of the witnesses. And that's one thing that's always been announced in Christianity, that Jesus came back from the dead. He actually died and rose again. The central teaching of the New Testament from Paul reinforces that. As he says in his letter to the Corinthians, "For I delivered to you as the first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas," that's Peter, "then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom were still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James and then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me." Darrell Block, a commentator, says this: "This aspect of the resurrection hope is important, since often we feel that our sin or the devil is more powerful than we are. Yet in the context of Jesus' power obtained through his resurrection, we have access to the one who enables us to overcome whatever obstacles Satan places in our path. The call of the disciples is to follow the leading of the Lord and to draw on the spiritual resources he makes available to us. So the power of the Holy Spirit came through Jesus' sacrifice and resurrection. It came to us all. That enables us to know Jesus in a very personal manner. So let's read then from the story from the pages of the Bible. Jesus appears to two disciples. That same day, two of Jesus' disciples were going to the village of Emmaus. The same day, so this is about the afternoon, Jesus rose at the crack of dawn. These disciples had been in Jerusalem with the Passover. They weren't members of the 12, but one of that other wider collection of disciples that followed Jesus. And they were on their way to the village of Emmaus, which was about 7 miles from Jerusalem. As they were talking and thinking about what had happened, Jesus came near and started walking along beside them, but they did not know who he was. Jesus asked them, "What were you talking about as you walked along?" The two of them stood there, looking sad and gloomy. Then one named Cleopas asked Jesus, "Are you the only person from Jerusalem who didn't know what was happening there over these last few days?" "What do you mean?" Jesus asked. They answered, "Those things that happened to Jesus from Nazareth. By what he did and said, he showed that he was a powerful prophet who pleased God and all the people. Then the chief priests and our leaders had him arrested and sentenced to die on the cross. He had hoped that he would be the one to set Israel free, but it has already been 3 days since all this happened. Some of our women in our group surprised us. They had gone to the tomb early in the morning, but they did not find the body of Jesus. They came back saying that they had seen a vision of angels who told them that he was alive. Some men from our group went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they didn't see Jesus either." Then Jesus asked the two disciples, "Why can't you understand? How can you be so slow to believe all that the prophets said? Didn't you know that the Messiah would have to suffer before he was given his glory?" Jesus then explained everything written about himself in the scriptures, beginning with the law of Moses and the books of the prophets. So, this is Jesus meeting these two men on the road to Emmaus. We're not sure where Emmaus is. We're told in the story it's about 6-7 miles away from Jerusalem, and they were walking there. But we're not sure where Emmaus is today. The disciples were obviously worried, confused. They'd heard some reports, but hadn't stayed in Jerusalem, but were coming back home to where they lived, just outside Jerusalem. Who are these two disciples? Well, we know one was called Cleopas. Now, strangely enough, if we go back to John 19, we're told that Cleopas' wife was with Mary Magdalene and Mary at the scene of the actual crucifixion. So it's quite possible these two disciples could have been Cleopas and his wife. But of course the Christian church, as it grew up in a male-dominated society, has always taken two disciples to be two men. We're not sure, but it's just an interesting fact. That's where the name comes from. So this passage begins with these two disciples not sure that Jesus has risen. They'd heard the stories, they heard the account of the empty tomb, they were confused and were making their way back home. And then Jesus appears on the same road, walking with them, and obviously starts to listen to their conversation. And the film gives the impression that these two disciples were a bit reluctant to talk about the resurrection and the death of Jesus, because it had been carried out by the chief priests and the Romans. So they were a bit suspicious of this person, and they were confused. Some people say Jesus was risen, but they'd got no proof of that. The scriptures tell us in the story that these two men were reluctant to believe that the tomb was empty. And then Jesus comes along them and stood with them. Sad and gloomy they were. And Cleopas asked this bit of a cheeky question. Are you the only person in Jerusalem who didn't know what was happening these days? Why do we have to tell you about this? Surely you must have heard of this crucifixion, about Jesus, the prophet. Surely you've heard. Because we gather from the rest of the stories in the gospel that Jesus' mission was becoming well known in amongst all the people from Galilee through Samaria to Judea, where Jerusalem is. And that's why the chief priests plotted to do away with him, because they didn't want to lose their power and authority with the Romans governing the country. So there was a bit of a hesitation. They must have known. There would have been tension. These sort of rumours would have gathered even in a society without any mobile phones or social media. These two men very much in that thing. These two disciples on their way are perhaps in deep depression. They believed in Jesus. Suddenly he's died. They can't cope with that. Now he's told he's alive, and they're not sure of what's going on here. I'm sure, like many other of the disciples, the 12 even, that they believed that Jesus was going to liberate the Jewish people from the rule of the Romans. They believed he was coming as king, but king to take over. And that's why the resurrection was such a defeatist act in their understanding of the situation. But the truth is, these two disciples, for all the criticism we might aim at them, are no different from us. If we're looking to follow Jesus, we've got to get over that hurdle of believing that Jesus rose from the dead, that the evidence is enough to satisfy us 2,000 years from the actual event themselves that this was real. So Jesus challenges their doubt, and beginning with all the prophets, Jesus explains to them what was said in all the scriptures. Now we know, in the sense that here, throughout his teaching, Jesus often referred back to the prophecies of the Old Testament during his teaching of the disciples. But nobody really caught on to this until he died, until they met him. But we all know, surely, especially if you sat under my ministry for a few years, that there are plenty of references in the Old Testament scriptures, as we've looked at them, that refer to the way the Messiah is going to come to save the world, that he is going to suffer and he is going to die and he is going to be raised again. And Jesus takes this time to reiterate what he probably taught these disciples before about the nature of the work he was going to do. But like those disciples, we sometimes too find it difficult to realise that this is such an important part of our faith, and we have to have confidence in what the scriptures say. Nigel Wright says this: it wasn't simply then that they couldn't recognise Jesus. There was nothing in the Jewish resurrection hope to indicate that this would happen, but it seems that Jesus' body emerging from the tomb had been transformed. It was the same yet different, a mystery which we shall perhaps never unravel until we ourselves share the same risen life. But the fact that they couldn't recognise Jesus at first seems to have gone with the fact that they couldn't recognise the events that had just happened as the story of God's redemption. This is the fact that we have to get over, that the only way that we can inherit eternal life is the fact that Jesus had to die to deal with the sin that stops us having a relationship with God. The fact that Jesus was sacrificed like the lambs before him on the altar, but on the cross, and rose from the grave, was the act which God put into plan to deal with it. And because we believe in Jesus and his resurrection, our sins and any barrier that we may have had doesn't now prevent us from having that personal relationship with God. That's what it took. So this is what's happening in this story. This is why Luke accounts for it. He believes it's important for us as Christians today to know the facts, that we have to get over this barrier, that Jesus rose from the grave. But of course, what happened was that the disciples eventually recognised him. I don't know how many of you I've told this to before, but forgive me if you've heard this several times before. I became a Christian when I was about 30. Though I'd grown up in the Christian church as a child and went there till I was about 15, I then left, and Christianity had no part in my life until I suddenly found myself in a hospital bed staring at a ceiling for 3 months because I fell off a ladder and broke my back, and my life was falling apart. But out of that disaster came an introduction to Jesus through 2 neighbours. I fell off this ladder, and at this time I had the windows as my lounge out and was doing some decorating and painting the house. And I'd taken the windows out, pounded the frames downstairs, and I was going back up on the ladder to do the first floor windows when the ladder cracked and I fell. And laid there for not too long, fortunately, before somebody heard my cries and called an ambulance. But I was in this hospital bed, and 2 neighbours who had never spoken to us before came to my wife later that night when she got back from the hospital and still got all the lounge house completely open to the elements because there were no windows in the house. They'd all been taken out, ready to be put back. And these 2 Christian neighbours come up from down the road where we lived, heard what had happened, knocked on the door as she got in from the hospital and said, "Can we help?" And she said, "Well, I don't know." She said, "Well, we happen to be a family that's involved in windows and carpentry and all that. Would you like us to put these windows back in for you?" And she said, "Oh, yes, please." And they stayed up half the night putting these windows back in my house. And these two were Christians. And then they came back the next day and a few days after, and they started helping with taking my wife to hospital because she didn't drive, along with many other people. And then they said to say, help out, we go to this church down the road, we've got a great kids' Sunday school, would you like us to take the two kids with us? And my wife said, oh great, take them off my hands. You just imagine, can't you? Two young children at the time. And they started to go to Sunday, and they regularly picked them up for Sunday school. And then, when I came out, after about 3 months in hospital, I struggled for a bit. My wife used to take these children down to Sunday school on a Sunday, and then shortly, about a month later, they knocked on our door and said, we're moving. Oh. So we were sorry to see them go. They'd become reasonable friends then, good friends. We kept them at a bit of a distance because they were Christians, but they were good friends. And so anyway, the kids wanted to still go to Sunday school. So it was a question of, we'll take them to Sunday school on a Sunday morning. Not a problem. I needed the exercise to get walking again. And walked down to the church, dropped the children off at Sunday school, walked back, and then it was time to walk back to the church again, because to get back to the church, it was about 3/4 of an hour's walk. So I thought, I can't do this, going backwards and forwards twice. So I just don't know what made me did it, but I went in and sat with the kids in the Sunday school, and I went and sat in the back of the church and listened to the service and then picked the kids up. And my wife did the same. And I can always remember sitting in this church on a Sunday morning, knowing roughly, because I'd been to church for 10 years, so I knew what it was all about. I knew some of the songs, I knew bits of the Bible stories. And then this man stood up in the pulpit and spoke, I'm sure, entirely about me for 4 weeks. Everything he said seemed to hit home in my heart. And the strange thing is, I think it's funny now, Lord's permission, but on the weeks my wife went, the same thing happened to us. And after a few months, as we got to know this lovely crowd of Christians and the hope that the minister shared, we became Christians, we were baptised there. But it's this over. Now, one of the struggles I had as being a detective, I was just going through detective school when this happened, learning about the law. I was learning about the law of evidence. Because back in those days, the role of a detective is vastly different to what it was now. When you got a case, you dealt with the case right from beginning to end. You was the one who prosecuted it in court. You had to the one who had to serve the evidence on the defence. And of course, we needed a certain amount of additional legal training to go through that above the ordinary police officers. And of course, one of the things that I struggled with at the beginning was, what about the evidence for the crucifixion? And of course, there is evidence if you look for it, if you understand it, and you value the word of witnesses and the facts that are recorded. And now I can assure you there's plenty of facts in the scriptures that allow us to believe and have a surety that if you were sitting on a jury listening solely to the facts for the first time, you can come to the conclusion that Christ rose from the dead. And of course, the additional thing sometimes is people still try to do that academically. It can be done. But of course, until your heart is open to the Spirit of God, you will never really understand. So it's important. This is why I think Luke's included this story. These disciples wanted evidence that Jesus was alive. They were fortunate. because they actually met the risen Christ. They didn't see him and understand him at first, but gradually they understood, because we believe that Jesus was going through a transforming act of what he looked like, getting into the body that he needed to be glorified. But Jesus says to Thomas, that other disciple that doubted, long after these two had met Jesus on the road, Thomas heard their testimony, and so did he hear the testimony of many others, dozens of people, that they'd met Jesus. Thomas just wasn't around, and he met it. And when he met Jesus, he fell on his feet and said, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus replied to him, "Blessed are those who don't see me as you see me, but believe instead." So these disciples eventually got to the house. Let's carry on with the story. When the two of them came near the village where they were going, Jesus seemed to be going farther. They begged him, "Stay with us. It's already late and the sun is going down." So Jesus went into the house to stay with them. After Jesus sat down to eat, he took some bread, he blessed it and broke it. Then he gave it to them. At once they knew who he was, but he then disappeared. They said to each other, "When he talked with us along the road and explained the scriptures to us, didn't it warm our hearts?" So they got up right away and returned to Jerusalem. The two disciples found the 11 apostles and the others gathered together, and they learned from the group that the Lord was really alive and he had appeared to Peter. Then the disciples from Emmaus told what had happened on the road and how they knew he was with the Lord when he broke bread. And then we go on a bit later in the story, we're not going to deal with that today, where Jesus appears to all the disciples. Why? Because his words, when he said these words, he broke bread and blessed it. They recognised his voice. Very similar to Mary Magdalene. This is the account. Luke is echoing the story, really, of the first meal of creation, isn't he, here? When he took bread and broke it and gave it to them, their eyes were both opened and they recognised who he was. And remember in the Garden of Eden, when Eve took the apple, ate it and passed it on to Adam, their eyes were opened and they saw not God, but Satan himself. So the couple in Emmaus discovered that the long curse had been broken. Death itself had been defeated. God's new creation, brimming with life and joy and new possibilities, has burst upon them and made the world anew. Jesus himself, risen from the dead, is the beginning of the sign of the new world which we are in at this time. Jesus was a prophet. He was like the Son of David. He was the suffering servant, the Son of Man. Now, because he's risen from the dead, he is God's Son, sitting on the right hand of him in heaven, and is the bridge between us and that heaven too. When Luke describes Jesus as a prophet and Messiah, it underscores how the promise only makes sense when it's combined with Jesus. The Old Testament promises that talk about the Messiah make sense to us far more than what it did to the first disciples, because we're on this side of the cross. The resurrection cements the whole story together. And we need to believe what the scriptures say. The writer of Hebrews says, long ago, God spoke to the fathers by the prophets at different times and in different places. In these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. God has anointed him heir of all things and made the universe through him. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact expression of his nature, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After making purification for our sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, so he became superior to the angels, just as the name he inherited is more excellent than theirs. You know, we can't go many weeks without looking at some art. My favourite subject. This is Caravaggio's pitching of the Supper at Emmaus. It's a bit dark on this screen, but if you want to look at it in detail, type the Supper of Emmaus into the search engines and you'll come up with a clearer picture. But I like this story that Caravaggio, one of the major artists in the 15th and 16th century, this picture shows of Jesus sitting at this table at the moment the disciples realise that they're eating with Jesus himself. The disciple on the right has suddenly jumping up in the act of jumping up with his arms outstretched to give Jesus a hug, I'm sure. The other one is using the arms of the table, his chair, to dart up, to get to his feet. And yet perhaps the brother is the one at the back, is standing there with his hands in his belt, thinking, what was this all about? The surprise of joy and the expression of joy on the two disciples is great. The one who's not sure what on earth is going on is surprised and doesn't hardly move. Lovely way that Caravaggio paints that story. The way Luke describes this mealtime takes our minds back also to the upper room, doesn't it? And it should take us back to the times when we have communion here. The words that Jesus spoke are the words we repeat when we have communion to remind us of the sacrifice that Jesus went through in order that we could be close friends, true brothers and sisters of him and sons of the living God.